B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, December 19th, 2019. It's the day after Trump's impeachment by the House of Representatives. And in a shrewd move that still had the negative impact of kind of overshadowing the historic impeachment votes that are likely not to produce Trump's removal from office, Nancy Pelosi tipped her hand shortly after the impeachment votes were completed that she's not in a hurry to send the approved articles of impeachment over to the U.S. Senate to trigger the process of a trial of the President of the United States. Now, I believe it's a shrewd move, and it shows that Pelosi is really gifted, has a mastery of the procedures and the arcane rules of our congressional system. And I think that it's smart politics not to simply deliver by ordinary first-class mail the articles of impeachment into the clutches of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. And so this sets up a little tussle. I'll use a football metaphor. Nancy's got the ball right now. She won't pass it to McConnell before the rules of the game have been laid out clearly. And this is something that I've known about Nancy Pelosi for a long time, and it frustrates some people. But she believes in the concept of ripeness, and that is you don't make a decision or you don't execute it until you absolutely have to. You maintain your options and prerogatives. You try not to tip your hand until the moment when that is required. And you can argue that Pelosi honestly answered the questions because some pundits had raised the idea of not sending the voted articles to the Senate at all. Just to pocket them and say, yep, we impeached him. We know that he won't get, this is not going to be a fair process in the Senate. And so we are going to just leave it at that. Now, that seems to be denying us, and I don't want to get too sexual or graphic here, but it's not allowing us to orgasm, to really take this to completion. And I don't think that that has ever been the intention of Pelosi and her leadership in the House. But there is no reason to telegraph your intentions to Mitch McConnell. And as I said, to simply deliver this to him for him to snuff it out. So there are some people who want to delay, others advocating that they should be withheld altogether. And this does, although McConnell gave a 30-minute speech on the floor of the Senate this morning and was full of his usual piss and vinegar, he knows that he's got to deal with Pelosi, and he has to at least lay out the majority's plans for conducting this trial. And the rules in the Constitution are vague. They don't say that witnesses have to be produced, testimony has to be heard. And because of the lockstep cultish majority of the Republicans in the Senate, we can expect moves to try to kill this, try to limit it, try to prevent witnesses like Mick Mulvaney or former White House counsel Don McGahn from testifying about the president's obstructive behavior. So this is an interesting move. It does add a little bit of suspense to what has been a pretty flat anticlimactic process so far. And in the power quote of the day, Nancy Pelosi quoted an unnamed founding father saying that they had worried that we might encounter a rogue president, and that's why we would need impeachment. And Pelosi said of McConnell, I don't think anybody expected that we would have a rogue president and a rogue leader in the Senate at the same time. And James Clyburn, number 3 House Democrat, said he's willing to wait as long as it takes to transmit these 2 impeachment articles. Now, as you know, I believe that, unfortunately, the way that Mitch McConnell has trashed the democratic process and the product, he calls it thin. He has other lines of describing how trivial he thinks this is. And in a moment, we're going to list a number of impeachable offenses that the Democrats failed to address. It is technically possible for them to impeach him again, to conduct an inquiry into other potential high crimes and misdemeanors that call for his removal from office. But Pelosi's been so allergic to impeachment and insisted she managed this effort, in a micromanaging way. And she insisted that only 2 articles come forward, not addressing what many of us believe are clear crimes, clearer than the Ukraine Gate narrative. So the counterprogramming last night, as many people were watching, and certainly many people didn't watch the impeachment, it was frustrating to just see both sides go back and forth, clinging to the same talking points. He's not above the law. It was a perfect phone call. But Trump decided to stage a mob rally. He took his battle to Battle Creek, Michigan, the home of Kellogg's Rice Krispies. And he gave a snap, crackle, pop. And the bonus for his MAGA-wearing mob there in Michigan was that he defamed the late John Dingell and ridiculed the widow who took his seat that he had occupied for 59 years, Debbie Dingell. And this is just another low blow. I'm sure some people were relieved that he didn't go after the late John McCain in his 2-hour, according to people who pay attention, this is the longest rambling mob rally speech that he has given. He did digress into modern toilets, lack of adequate flushing power, said that women had told him that dishwashers have lost their muscle. I mean, he loves to share the bizarre inner workings of the mind of a stable genius. And we're left on the receiving end. And according to the account by the New York Times reporter who was caged at the rally, the reporter says, after a riff about Trump's presidential rival 2016, his audience whipped up a chant of "lock her up." Trump also lashed out at a woman who was escorted from the auditorium by security after interrupting him and making profane gestures, and encouraged security to act more forcefully to remove her. "You got to get a little bit stronger than that, folks," he said. This is like World Wrestling entertainment. And that really is the motif that the Republicans have used in the House process so far, and that may be employed in the Senate trial as well. Trump went after the Democrats, declaring that they'd embarked on a political suicide march, said that Americans would soon vote Speaker Nancy Pelosi the hell out of office. Now, there's a guy here in San Francisco, Shahid Buttar, a man I've known since he worked on civil liberties issues. We've been buddies for over 10 years. And Shahid is trying to unseat Nancy Pelosi. But frankly, based on past history, that is unlikely. Of course, they said that about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, too. But when Trump went after Dingell and his widow, the reporter says that the room kind of went quiet. The crowd was uneasy. Trump fumed that she had voted for his impeachment, even though he had ordered lowering of the flags after her husband's death. And he made it so personal. "I gave her the rotunda," he said. Well, he doesn't control the rotunda. The lying in state was done under the auspices of the House of Representatives, nothing to do with the executive branch, the president, or the White House. But, of course, he believes that his ego is so expansive and that we believe he controls everything and that he should. And so then he said that John Dingell may be looking down at us, or maybe he's looking up. Just more trash talk from 45. Oh, and get this. Rachel Maddow's going to be doing a little dance when she reports this tonight. In his marathon annual press conference, Vladimir Putin told Russians that this is an absolutely made-up set of impeachment charges. Quote, the Democratic Party, which lost the elections, is achieving results through other means. By accusing Trump at first of conspiracy with Russia, then it turns out there was no conspiracy at all. It then turned out that there was no collusion, and it could not form the basis for an impeachment, and now there is this made-up pressure on Ukraine. A little later, he said, I doubt they will want to remove their own party's representative from power based on what I think are absolutely made-up reasons. That's a reference to the lockstep Senate majority that is unlikely to allow the removal of Trump. And a lot of people are scratching their heads about the decision by Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, a Democratic presidential candidate, to abstain from the vote by voting present. And she'd been coy all along about impeachment, and she packages it this way, which I find pretty unpersuasive. Quote from Tulsi, after doing my due diligence and reviewing the 658-page impeachment report, I came to the conclusion I couldn't in good conscience vote either yes or no. I could not in good conscience vote against impeachment because I believe President Trump is guilty of wrongdoing. I also could not in good conscience vote for impeachment because removal of a sitting president must not be the culmination of a partisan process fueled by tribal animosities that have so gravely divided our country. Well, I think that's a pretty bullshit excuse for straddling, for failing to make a decision, and maybe it's just another look-at-me moment. And as you know, I have advocated for Tulsi Gabbard to be on the debate stage. I believe that her positions about regime change wars are essential for Democrats to confront. But this is just a sort of theater. And I don't embrace it, and I don't respect it. I'm not alone. She was targeted by Claire McCaskill, the former conservative from Missouri who served, 2 terms in the Senate. She's now got a paid perch at MSDNC. And of Gabbard's move, McCaskill said, that's just stupid. What is the point? I don't know what this woman thinks she is accomplishing by that. We're talking about her, and really we shouldn't spend any time talking about her. Well, maybe not on this issue. They should be talking about her in relation to U.S. foreign policy and the morphing of the Democratic Party into a hawkish pro-war entity. And I'll remind you that in my viewing of the coverage last night, there was way too much attention paid to Trump and his rally, often with split screens, pull quotes, a quick soundbite was delivered. And when you see somebody going out there, telling a string of lies, riling up a mob, simply to provide entertainment for his base and a perch for him to attack the legitimate process, as I quibble with it, it's still legitimate. This guy's impeachable. Well, our media is a big part of this problem. And I think most of us know it. Jeff Van Drew made it official. He was the only Democrat who voted against both articles of impeachment, and he went to the White House to see the Don today and to formalize his switch from the Democratic Party to formally announce that he is now a Republican. Now, this is clearly a survival effort on the part of Van Drew. But for him to kiss up to Trump, say that he has Van Drew's undying support in exchange for Trump's endorsement, he simply looked at the polls and knew he couldn't get reelected. And his future is more important than ours. And I'll remind him that people who have switched parties, like Joe Lieberman, he got one extra term out of it from Connecticut. And then there was Arlen Specter from Pennsylvania, who switched parties. And then my pal Joe Sestak beat him in the primary, despite the fact that the Obama administration and the Democratic leadership at the time supported the recently converted Arlen Specter. Well, Mehdi Hasan has done a good job of listing all of the impeachable offenses that the Democrats ignored. And he alphabetized them. Let's just dip in for a few. Amazon, related to the way Trump instructed the Postmaster General to double shipping rates, trying to get even with Jeff Bezos. Bigotry, the way that he referred to African countries as shitholes. CNN, the way he intervened in the AT&T and Time Warner merger, trying to punish CNN. The deaths of migrant children, the emoluments clause related to the hotel down the street from the White House, fraud, hush money, incitement of violence. Jared, you get the idea. I've linked up to the article, and you can get the full A to Z list. Just check the show file at peterbcollins.com. And there's an instructive piece by law professor Stephen Lubet, or Lubet, I'm not sure. He's at Northwestern University. And writing at Consortium News today, he clarifies that the members of the Senate who sit in judgment of a president who's been impeached are not consistent with jurors. And we're hearing that come out a lot. Chairman Jerry Nadler, I believe Pelosi has used it. And he writes that going back to the Clinton impeachment in 1999, the Democratic Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa, who I knew a little bit, and he's a pretty good guy, he said, I object to the use and continued use of the word jurors when referring to the Senate. And Chief Justice Rehnquist upheld his objection. And he said, what we do here today does not just, here's Harkin. What we do here doesn't just decide the fate of one man. Future generations will look back on this trial, not just to find out what happened, but to try to decide what principles governed our actions. And the Chief Justice then said the Senate is not simply a jury, it is a court in this case. Rehnquist then admonished the House managers to refrain from referring to the senators as jurors. They were called triers of law and fact. And this recognizes that it's not like a jury trial where people come in who have no exposure to the allegations against the defendant. Impartial justice does not, I'm reading from the article, does not demand the enforced naivete of jury service, which would be impossible in an impeachment trial. The senators all have prior knowledge of at least some of the facts, and several of them are currently vying to run against Trump next year, while others are backing his re-election campaign. But the Senate's oath of impartiality clearly calls for at least some commitment to objectivity. Thus, the problem with McConnell is not that he failed to behave like a juror, it's that he has declared an intention to disregard the oath, which was set up long ago by Republicans. So I think that is an interesting footnote. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And I want to thank Paul Elsesser, one of our most dedicated subscribers here at the podcast. John Sisney just renewed his annual subscription. Doug Cooper, David Radcliffe, and Gunnar Gunderson each chip in $5 or $10 a month. I appreciate all of you. Want to wish you all the best for the holidays and the best attempt at a Happy New Year that we can put together. And I encourage you to share a podcast during the holidays and invite friends, family, and like-minded individuals to check out what we do here and see if they want to become supporters as well. Thank you for your support. Well, Obamacare is now standing wobbly on 2 out of 4 legs as a federal appeals court in New Orleans yesterday struck down the individual mandate. And the issue now is whether the law completely collapses as a result. And this gets into complicated legal issues of what is called severability. And when you write a law, there's usually a severability clause that says if one part of this is found to be unconstitutional, the rest will still stand. But it is so complicated because of the Supreme Court decision that called the penalty for failure to honor the individual mandate a tax, and therefore declared that Obamacare was constitutional. Now, the bottom line for me is that Democrats have to recognize that Obamacare will be finished off by the Republicans one way or another. And when you hear Joe Biden and Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar talk about building on Obamacare, it is a foundation that has largely been demolished. And in the presidential debate tonight, the labor issues at Loyola Marymount have been put aside. They've been resolved. And so we're going to get Andrew Yang, Pete Buttigieg, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Amy Klobuchar, and Tom Steyer. And I hope we're going to get past this bullshit of arguing about my plan versus your plan. Because as I'm telling you, the future of Obamacare is seriously at risk. That's more than 17 million people who get their coverage. And the Democrats need to get beyond the false claims of socialism under Medicare for All and really honor the needs of the American people for clarity on health care policy. Well, you know, technically we're not ending the decade. That happens next year. But we are exiting the 20-teens, as on New Year's Day we turn the calendar to 2020. And over at BuzzFeed, they did a good job of looking back at our failures to address the climate crisis. And that 2009, 10 years ago, is when we started talking about it more as a crisis and an emergency, and we have actually slid backward. Only two countries, Morocco and Gambia, are living up to the terms of the Paris Agreement. And in a great report by Kate Aronoff, published at The Intercept today, she recounts how the rich nations at the recent Madrid summit used underhanded tactics. At one point, the people from NGOs, non-governmental organizations, had their entry badges taken by UN guards in skirmishes outside the main hall. Security prevented them from speaking even to the press. Now, they did restore their access and credentials a few hours later, but it's a bizarre effort that really is an image of the power of the industrialized nations and their, it's not just reticence, their refusal to deal with the issues, and it is the industrialized nations that have spewed the most carbon. And Harjit Singh, who heads up the global climate work for ActionAid, is quoted here, "There's no doubt rich countries have been blocking progress across the board." And Aronoff writes, "Not much has changed over the past decade. In 2009, the Copenhagen climate talks collapsed when a small subset of predominantly wealthy countries presented a hastily compiled 3-page document that all but negated years of work by the developing countries." And that pattern continues to this day. Today I'm releasing a fresh in-depth interview with my friend Dar Jamail, the author of an important book published early in 2019 called The End of Ice. And the book details the galloping rate that climate change is occurring. But in our conversation, we kind of went inside of Dar Jamail's head and his heart. And he talked openly of depression and almost despair about the inaction to address the issues that he has chronicled as a journalist at Truth Out and as the author of this new book. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with Dar Jamail.
In the dominant culture of this country, we don't do endings and we don't do feelings publicly, really, honestly, whereas in indigenous cultures, for example, if someone is grieving and mourning the loss of a loved one and they share that publicly, that's considered they're giving a gift in sharing that grief. with people. And that's the opposite of what we see in the dominant culture in the United States. And so I think we're a grief illiterate culture. It's like not okay, even looked down upon to express genuine, heartfelt feelings in public much of the time. And the reality is when we really understand the gravity of the crisis that's upon us, that, look, humans may well go extinct, and it could happen sooner rather than later. And what does that mean to people with children or people with grandchildren like Tom? And think about that. And it's terrifying and it's heartbreaking.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Dar Jamail. It's available for subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher. Well, the Democrats are doing it again. In 2018, as we pointed out, the House Campaign Committee recruited a lot of former Republicans, a lot of retired soldiers, a lot of former spooks, and a number of them became part of the freshman class in 2019. And as they face re-election next year, we will see if they can hold on to those seats. But on the Senate side, the Senate Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee is throwing its weight behind M.J. Hagar, who is running against John Cornyn in Texas. Hagar voted in the 2016 Republican primary. Then there's Mark Kelly, also known as Mr. Gabby Giffords, over in Arizona. He voted as a Republican as recently as 2012. And Barbara Bollier, who became a Democrat last year, is running in Kansas. So this is a pattern that I find offensive. And the Democrats continue to shy away from promoting progressives in the belief that Republican light is the winning path for the number 2 party. Here in California, AB 5 is going into effect on January 1st. It was intended to prevent the exploitation of gig workers like Uber drivers. But the people who are really screaming as the law is about to be enacted or activated are freelance writers and photographers who work for media organizations on a casual hire basis. And the AB 5 language restricts independent contractors from producing more than 35 written content submissions per year for a single publication. So that, for example, a college professor who was writing 1 column a week for the LA Times, they're going to be bounced. And one of the companies or outlets that celebrated the passage of the bill was Vox Media. And Vox has already announced that one of their subsidiaries, SB Nation, is laying off 200 California freelancers, switching instead to a much smaller number of people who are staff employees. And the other thing that I pointed out before is the newspaper industry, instead of fighting for modifications to this law to protect those freelance journalists, they insisted on a 1-year delay of implementation for the underpaid people who drive around throwing the newspapers onto your driveway. They want to continue to exploit those low-wage workers, many of whom are non-citizens. But they weren't too concerned about the people who create the content, often on the cheap, for these major media outlets. The Trump campaign is using a piece of software called Funware, P-H-U-N, Funware, produced by a company in Austin, Texas. And what does it do? Well, it has the ability to obtain GPS location data and the Wi-Fi network used by an individual cell phone, as well as user data that can infer an individual's gender, age, lifestyle preferences. And Steve Bannon claims that they used it to identify people who had been in a Catholic church so that they could send them anti-abortion messages during the 2018 midterm elections. It's just more insidious application of the technology that our government has been using on us, and now they're going to use it in political campaigns. There's a new report from the controversial agency called NIST, National Institute of Science and Technology, and this time NIST is feeding my bias. They have examined the state-of-the-art in facial recognition systems, and conclude that Asian and African American people were up to 100 times more likely to be misidentified than white men, depending on the particular algorithm and type of search being used. The highest false positives? Native Americans. The faces of African American women were falsely identified more often in the kinds of searches used by police investigators. And so it goes. No regulation, no effort to put the brakes on the expansion of AI and facial recognition, and we're seeing it rolled out across the entire country in China now. That will be our future, I fear. And finally today, another effort at censorship and cutting communications. Millions of mobile phones in New Delhi, India, the capital, went dead on Thursday after the city's police department ordered the country's largest carriers to cut off voice, text, and internet services in the wake of massive protests against a controversial new citizenship law that discriminates against Muslims. Local, state, and national authorities regularly shut down the internet in India 96 times this year. The region of Kashmir has been cut off since August. But this has never approached the major urban centers. And it shows that the Hindu nationalist government of Narendra Modi is more interested in discriminating against Muslims than in allowing its ordinary citizens to use communication devices up to and including for protest. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the place. You'll find it on YouTube. I remain Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until